In 1740, the colony of South Carolina passed a law so detailed in its cruelty that it listed, item by item, exactly which parts of the human body could be legally destroyed as punishment. They called it the Negro Act, and that law stayed on the books for over 125 years. But here is the part most people never learn in school. South Carolina was not the exception. It was the model. Across the American colonies, the Caribbean and Latin America, lawmakers sat in elegant rooms and debated, with absolute seriousness, whether cutting off an ear should carry the same legal weight as branding a forehead. These were not rogue acts of violence carried out in secret. These were laws, written, published, debated, and enforced by courts. Today, we are going to walk through 27 punishments of slavery that were fully legal, punishments so brutal that many were eventually banned, not because lawmakers had a moral awakening, but because they became embarrassing in the eyes of international trade partners. And here is what will keep you watching until the very end. Some of these laws were never formally repealed. They simply gathered dust on shelves, technically enforceable, for decades after abolition. If that does not make you rethink what you know about legal history, nothing will. Let us start with the punishments that left visible marks on the body, the ones that were so normalized they had official names in court documents and plantation ledgers. Punishment number 1, regulated whipping. You might think whipping was just random violence, something an angry overseer did on impulse, but the reality is far more disturbing. Colonial law codes actually regulated whipping with specific numerical limits, not to protect the enslaved, but to create a bureaucratic system of escalation. In Virginia, the 1705 Slave Code authorized up to 39 lashes for a first offense of leaving a plantation without permission. 39. Not 40, because 40 was considered excessive under certain interpretations of biblical law. The precision was the cruelty. In South Carolina, the number varied by offense, from 15 lashes for being caught after curfew to 39 for attempted escape. In the French colonies, the Code Noir of 1724 specified that whipping could be administered by any white person who encountered an enslaved person violating curfew. Any white person. Not a court, not an officer, anyone. Records from the Louisiana colonial archives show that plantation owners kept punishment ledgers, literal accounting books where they recorded the date, the number of lashes, and the reason. These were not hidden documents. They were presented in court as evidence of orderly management. The regulated whipping system lasted in various legal forms until the end of the Civil War. Some states never formally repealed the specific statutes. They were simply superseded by the 13th Amendment. Punishment number 2, branding. And this one is worse than you think. Branding was not an act of rage. It was a legal identification system. Under the 1740 Negro Act in South Carolina, enslaved people convicted of running away for the first time could be branded on the right cheek with the letter R. The R stood for runaway. If they ran a second time, the law authorized branding on the left cheek. A third attempt allowed for the cutting of one ear. And if you are thinking this sounds medieval, remember this was the same century that produced the Declaration of Independence. In Maryland, branding was used to mark enslaved people convicted of theft. The letter T was burned into the thumb. In Virginia, branding was applied to the shoulder for various infractions. The tools were standardized. Plantation blacksmiths made branding irons to order, and their production is documented in ironwork inventories from the 18th century. Historian Dana Ramey Berry, in her research on the economic valuation of enslaved bodies, found that branding actually reduced the market value of an enslaved person by 10 to 15%, which meant that owners only used it when they wanted to send a message to the entire plantation community. The legal authorization for branding was not repealed in South Carolina until 1865. And even then, it was repealed as part of a blanket revision of slave codes, not as a specific moral rejection of the practice. Now, here is where most people would expect me to move on to the next punishment. But punishment number 3 is one that most Americans have never heard of, and it might be the most psychologically terrifying device ever legalized. Punishment number 3, the iron collar with spikes, known in French colonies as the carcan and in Spanish colonies as the collar de púas. This was a heavy iron ring fitted around the neck with long prongs, extending outward in all directions, sometimes 12 to 18 inches long. The collar made it impossible to lie down, to rest a head against anything, or to move through dense vegetation. It was a legal punishment for repeated escape attempts, and it was designed not just to cause suffering, but to make the wearer a visible warning to every other enslaved person on the plantation. The 1685 Code Noir in the French Caribbean authorized the iron collar for first-time runaways who had been absent for more than a month. For a second offense lasting more than a month, the hamstrings could be cut. For a third offense, the punishment was death. These were not suggestions, they were law. In Louisiana, iron collars were documented in court records as late as 1856, just 5 years before the Civil War began. Archaeological excavations at plantation sites in the American South have uncovered fragments of these collars, confirming that their use was widespread, not exceptional. The psychological impact was calculated. An enslaved person wearing the collar could not sleep properly for weeks, leading to exhaustion, disorientation, and complete psychological breakdown. Plantation records describe this as the collar making the wearer more compliant. The legal codes that authorized these devices were never individually repealed. They simply became unenforceable after emancipation. Punishment number 4, ear cropping. This was exactly what it sounds like, and it was perfectly legal in at least 7 colonies. In South Carolina, the 1740 Negro Act authorized the removal of one ear for a third escape attempt. In Virginia, ear cropping was authorized for enslaved people convicted of hog stealing, a common charge that was often fabricated to justify punishment. In the British Caribbean, particularly Jamaica and Barbados, ear cropping was used as a standard punishment for what the codes called insolence toward any white person. Court records from Jamaica in the 1750s show that ear cropping was so routine that judges did not even record detailed justifications. They simply noted, cropped, and moved to the next case. What makes this punishment particularly significant is that it was a form of permanent, visible disfigurement that marked the victim for life. Unlike whipping, which could heal and fade, a missing ear was a permanent signal to every person the victim encountered for the rest of their life. It said, this person resisted, and the state punished them for it. Ear cropping was formally prohibited in Jamaica in 1788, making it one of the earliest punishments to be legislatively banned. But its prohibition came not from moral outrage, but from economic calculation. Planters argued that disfigured enslaved people were harder to sell, and that economic logic brings us to punishment number 5, which reveals something even darker about how the legal system worked. Punishment number 5. Tongue boring. In several colonies, enslaved people caught speaking their native African languages, practicing non-Christian religious rituals, or speaking against their owners could be punished by having their tongues pierced with a hot iron. This was documented in the early Virginia codes and in Caribbean plantation records. The punishment was specifically designed to attack communication, to make it physically painful to speak and therefore to organize, to pray, to sing, or to pass information. A 1723 Virginia statute authorized tongue boring for enslaved people who gave false testimony, though what constituted false testimony was determined entirely by white witnesses. The cruelty was not just physical, it was strategic. By targeting the tongue, The legal system was targeting the primary tool of cultural preservation, of resistance planning, of community bonding. Historian Kenneth Stamp, in The Peculiar Institution, documented multiple instances of tongue boring across the southern colonies and noted that it was often used in conjunction with other punishments, meaning a single offense could result in both whipping and tongue boring. Punishment number 6, tooth extraction as identification. This one sounds almost unbelievable, but it is documented in multiple sources. In certain regions, particularly in the lower Mississippi Valley and parts of the Caribbean, enslaved people were identified by having specific teeth removed. This was not a punishment for a specific offense. It was a preemptive identification measure, like tattooing a serial number. Plantation records from Louisiana in the early 1800s described the practice matter-of-factly, listing identifying marks including missing teeth alongside height, weight, and scars. The practice was especially common for enslaved people who were rented out to other plantations, since the tooth pattern served as a form of identification if the person attempted to escape. There is no record of any colonial legislature formally authorizing tooth extraction as punishment, which makes it even more revealing. It existed in a legal gray zone where plantation owners had such absolute authority over enslaved bodies that they did not need specific legal permission. The absence of a law against it was the same as permission. Now, if you are still watching, I need to warn you. The next punishment was specifically designed to silence people, literally, and its existence was hidden for centuries. Punishment number 7. The tin mask, also known as the Flanders mask or the iron muzzle. This was a metal device locked around the head that covered the mouth and sometimes the nose, making it nearly impossible to eat, drink, or speak without assistance. It was used as punishment for enslaved people accused of eating sugarcane in the fields, drinking alcohol, or speaking out against their condition. In Brazil, the tin mask was so common that it appears in multiple 19th-century illustrations and photographs. The most famous image is an 1839 lithograph by Jacques-Étienne Arago showing an enslaved woman in Rio de Janeiro wearing a full iron muzzle. In the American South, the device was known as a slave muzzle and was advertised in newspapers alongside chains and padlocks. A classified advertisement in the New Orleans Bee from 1837 offers iron muzzles of various sizes for immediate purchase. The legal status of the tin mask varied by jurisdiction. In most southern states, it fell under the general authority of slave owners to discipline their property as they saw fit. There was no specific law authorizing it, but there was no law prohibiting it either. The device was designed to humiliate as much as to physically restrict. An enslaved person wearing the mask could not eat independently, could not communicate clearly, and was reduced to a state of absolute dependency and visibility. The mask said, "This person cannot be trusted to control their own mouth." Punishment number 8, extended chaining. While chains were a constant feature of slavery, extended chaining as a specific punishment involved chaining an enslaved person to a fixed point, often a post or tree, for days or weeks at a time, exposed to weather, insects, and starvation. In the Caribbean, this was documented as a standard punishment on sugar plantations. Records from Barbados in the 1780s describe enslaved people chained to posts in the cane fields for up to 2 weeks, given only enough water to survive. The legal authorization came from the broad disciplinary powers granted to overseers under colonial law. In Jamaica, the Consolidated Slave Law of 1792 gave overseers authority to confine enslaved people in stocks or chains for up to 24 hours without any judicial process. In practice, the 24-hour limit was routinely ignored, and no overseer was ever prosecuted for exceeding it. Extended chaining was also used as a public spectacle. a warning to other enslaved people. The chained person was deliberately placed in a visible location, often near the entrance to the slave quarters, so that every person coming and going would see them. Punishment number 9. The picket. This was a military punishment adopted by plantation overseers, and it was as brutal as anything on a battlefield. The victim was suspended by their thumbs or wrists from a beam or tree branch, with their toes barely touching the ground. The body's own weight became the instrument of torture. In the American South, the picket was documented in plantation records from Virginia, the Carolinas, and Louisiana. A formerly enslaved man named Moses Roper described the picket in his 1838 autobiography, explaining that he was suspended for hours until his shoulders dislocated. The picket was never specifically authorized by statute, but it was never prohibited either. It existed within the vast space of disciplinary discretion that the law granted to slave owners. Court cases from the antebellum period show that judges consistently ruled that owners had the right to discipline enslaved people by any means they deemed necessary, as long as they did not kill them. And even that limit was weakly enforced. Between 1800 and 1860, fewer than a dozen slave owners in the entire American South were convicted of killing an enslaved person. Those first 9 punishments were all physical, all visible, all designed to mark the body. But the next 9 punishments targeted something even more fundamental. They targeted the mind, the family, and the very possibility of being human. Punishment number 10, forced family separation. This is often discussed as a feature of slavery, but rarely understood as a specific legal punishment. In multiple jurisdictions, the sale of family members to distant plantations was used as a formal, deliberate punishment for resistance. Court records from Virginia in the 1830s document cases where judges specifically ordered the sale of an enslaved person's children to different states as punishment for the parents' escape attempt. The children were not sold because of anything they did. They were sold to punish their mother or father. In Louisiana, the Civil Code of 1825 technically prohibited the sale of children under 10 separately from their mothers, but the law was so full of exceptions that it was functionally meaningless. An owner could claim economic hardship, and the court would approve the separation. Records from the interstate slave trade show that approximately 1 in 3 enslaved children in the Upper South was sold away from at least one parent by the age of 15. When used as punishment, the separation was deliberately publicized. The parent was forced to watch their children being taken away, and the entire community was made to witness it. This was not incidental cruelty. It was systematic legal, psychological warfare. Punishment number 11, criminalization of literacy. In 1831, following Nat Turner's rebellion, the state of Virginia passed a law making it a crime to teach any enslaved person to read or write. The punishment was not just for the enslaved person who learned, it was also for anyone who taught them, including white people. A white person convicted of teaching an enslaved person to read in Virginia could face a fine of up to $100 and up to 6 months in jail. In North Carolina, the penalty for an enslaved person caught reading was 39 lashes. In Georgia, the fine for teaching an enslaved person was $500 for a white offender and a whipping for a free black offender. South Carolina, Alabama, and Louisiana passed similar laws. What made these laws uniquely cruel was their targeting of knowledge itself. Every other punishment on this list targeted the body or relationships. This one targeted the mind's ability to grow. Frederick Douglass later wrote that learning to read was the pathway from slavery to freedom. And the lawmakers who criminalized literacy understood this perfectly. They were not punishing a physical act. They were punishing the possibility of intellectual independence. Punishment number 12. And this one should disturb you even more than physical violence. The criminalization of assembly. Across the slave-holding states, laws prohibited enslaved people from gathering in groups of more than 3 to 7 people, depending on the jurisdiction, without the presence of a white person. In South Carolina, the 1740 Negro Act prohibited gatherings of more than 7 enslaved people unless supervised. In Virginia, the limit was 5. In Georgia, after 1770, the limit was 3. The punishment for unauthorized assembly ranged from whipping to imprisonment to sale. But the real purpose was not to punish gatherings that had already occurred. It was to prevent them from ever happening. By criminalizing the simple act of being together, the legal system ensured that enslaved people could not organize worship, plan resistance, maintain cultural practices, mourn their dead, or celebrate anything as a community. Church services, funerals, weddings, and storytelling circles were all technically criminal acts unless a white person stood by and watched. The assembly laws remained on the books in most southern states until the end of the Civil War, and similar restrictions on black assembly resurfaced almost immediately under the Black Codes of 1865 and 1866. Punishment number 13, racial curfew. In every slave-holding state and colony, enslaved people were prohibited from moving freely after dark. In Charleston, South Carolina, a curfew bell rang at 9 o'clock, and any enslaved person found on the streets after that time without a written pass could be arrested, whipped, and jailed. In New Orleans, the curfew was enforced by armed patrols that had legal authority to stop, search, and punish any black person, enslaved or free, found outdoors after hours. In Virginia, the punishment for curfew violation was up to 20 lashes, administered on the spot by whoever caught the person. The curfew was not just about controlling movement at night, it was about controlling time itself. An enslaved person who could not move freely after dark, could not visit family members on neighboring plantations, could not attend secret religious services, could not plan or coordinate anything that required meeting under cover of darkness. The curfew laws are particularly significant because they were among the first slavery-era restrictions to be directly replicated in post-emancipation black codes. Sundown towns, where black people were prohibited from being present after dark, existed in parts of the United States well into the 20th century. The legal DNA of the racial curfew survived long after the curfew itself was abolished. Punishment number 14. Prohibition of testimony. In every slave-holding jurisdiction in the Americas, enslaved people were legally prohibited from testifying in court against any white person. This was not merely a procedural rule, it was a foundational architecture of impunity. An enslaved person who was beaten, raped, mutilated, or had their family destroyed had absolutely no legal recourse because the law declared their voice invalid. In Virginia, the 1705 Slave Code explicitly stated that no Negro, mulatto, or Indian shall be admitted as a witness in any cause whatsoever. In South Carolina, the rule was absolute. In Louisiana, the Code Noir allowed enslaved testimony only against other enslaved people. The practical effect was that any crime committed against an enslaved person by a white person was, for legal purposes, invisible. If no white witness was present or willing to testify, the crime simply did not exist in the eyes of the law. Court records reveal cases where judges acknowledged that violence had likely occurred, but dismissed the case because the only witnesses were enslaved. This legal silencing was not a side effect of slavery. It was one of its primary structural supports. Punishment number 15, prohibition of property ownership. Across the slave-holding South, enslaved people were legally prohibited from owning any property whatsoever. Since enslaved people were themselves classified as property, the legal logic was circular. Property cannot own property. In South Carolina, any goods, money, or livestock found in the possession of an enslaved person could be confiscated without process. In Virginia, enslaved people who cultivated personal garden plots technically did so at the pleasure of the owner, who could confiscate the harvest at any time. In the Caribbean, the situation was even more extreme. In Jamaica, any transaction involving an enslaved person was void by law. They could not buy, sell, trade, inherit, or bequeath anything. The prohibition of property ownership was used as a specific punishment when enslaved people had managed to accumulate hidden savings or trade goods through informal economies. Overseers would conduct searches of slave quarters and confiscate everything of value, from coins to clothing to tools. These confiscation raids were documented in plantation journals as routine maintenance of order. Punishment number 16, sail to the Deep South. In the upper South states of Virginia, Maryland, Kentucky, and Tennessee, the most feared punishment was not whipping, not branding, not the collar. It was being sold south. Being sold to the cotton or sugar plantations of Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, or Georgia was understood by everyone, enslaved and free, as a death sentence in slow motion. Sugar plantations in Louisiana had a life expectancy for field workers of approximately 7 years from arrival. Cotton plantations in Mississippi worked people to death at rates that required constant importation of new laborers from the Upper South. Historian Edward Baptist, in The Half Has Never Been Told, documented that the domestic slave trade between 1790 and 1860 forcibly relocated approximately 1 million enslaved people from the Upper South to the Deep South. The threat of being sold south was used explicitly as a punishment and control mechanism. Plantation records from Virginia show owners writing letters that reference the sale as a direct consequence of disobedience. One letter from 1842, preserved in the University of Virginia archives, states plainly, "If she runs again, sell her to the first Georgia trader that passes through." Punishment number 17, prohibition of legal marriage. In every slaveholding state, enslaved people were legally prohibited from entering into marriage contracts. This was not an oversight. It was a deliberate legal strategy. If enslaved people could marry, they could argue that separation from a spouse was a violation of their legal rights. By prohibiting marriage, the law ensured that family bonds had zero legal standing and could be broken at any time for any reason. In practice, many enslaved people formed deep and lasting partnerships, and some owners permitted informal ceremonies. But these marriages carried no legal weight whatsoever. A husband could be sold away from his wife, and neither had any legal claim to prevent it. Children born to enslaved mothers were automatically enslaved regardless of the father's status, and the owner of the mother was the legal owner of the child. The prohibition of marriage was one of the last slavery-era legal principles to be fully reversed. Even after emancipation, formerly enslaved couples had to navigate complex legal processes to have their unions formally recognized. And now we arrive at punishment number 18, which many historians consider the most systematically evil practice in the entire system. Punishment number 18, breaking. This was not a single act, but a deliberate multi-phase process designed to destroy an enslaved person's sense of identity, autonomy, and humanity. The process was most thoroughly documented by historian Kenneth Stamp, who identified its key stages: absolute submission to the owner's authority, creation of a sense of personal inferiority, acceptance of the owner's standards as the only valid standards, complete dependency on the owner for all physical needs, and the installation of a deep sense of helplessness. Breaking was applied most aggressively to newly purchased enslaved people, particularly those who had been captured from Africa or who had been free and were re-enslaved. The process involved isolation, sleep deprivation, Controlled starvation, random violence, forced witnessing of punishments inflicted on others, and the systematic destruction of any behavior that demonstrated independence or pride. What makes breaking uniquely horrifying is that it was discussed openly in slaveholder correspondence and agricultural journals. Plantation owners wrote to each other, asking for advice on how to break a particularly stubborn slave. Agricultural magazines published articles on the best methods. It was treated as a management technique, like training a horse, discussed in calm, practical language by men who considered themselves civilized. The legal system supported breaking through its silence. There was no law against it, because there was no law that recognized the psychological integrity of enslaved people as something worth protecting. If the first 18 punishments targeted individuals, the next 6 targeted entire communities. These were punishments designed to make every enslaved person responsible for every other enslaved person, to turn the community against itself, and to make resistance not just dangerous for the individual, but catastrophic for everyone they loved. Punishment number 19, destruction of subsistence gardens. On many plantations, enslaved people were allowed to cultivate small plots of land to supplement the inadequate rations provided by owners. These gardens were not just food sources, they were acts of autonomy. Tiny spaces where enslaved people could exercise choice, grow what they wanted, and trade surplus with neighbors. As punishment for collective infractions, overseers would destroy these gardens completely, ripping out crops, salting the soil, and confiscating any stored food. Plantation records from South Carolina in the 1820s document multiple instances of garden destruction as punishment for what overseers called a bad attitude among the workers. The destruction was always public and always total. Every plant was pulled, every seed store was emptied. The message was explicit: even the smallest space of independence exists only because we allow it, and we can take it away at any moment. Punishment number 20, confiscation of hidden savings. Despite the legal prohibition on property ownership, many enslaved people managed to accumulate small amounts of money or trade goods through informal economies, selling surplus vegetables, doing extra work for pay, or trading with free black people and sympathetic whites. When these hidden economies were discovered, confiscation was immediate and complete, but it was not just confiscation. The discovery of hidden savings was treated as evidence of theft, since legally an enslaved person could not own anything, and therefore anything they possessed must have been stolen. This circular logic meant that the punishment for saving money was being punished as a thief. Records from Mississippi plantations in the 1840s show enslaved people receiving 39 lashes for possessing coins, their own earnings from work done on Sundays. The confiscation was often accompanied by public humiliation, with the saved items displayed for the entire community to see before being taken. Punishment number 21, collective punishment. This was one of the most psychologically devastating tactics in the entire system. When a single enslaved person committed an offense, particularly an escape attempt, the entire slave community on the plantation could be punished. Every person in the quarters would receive reduced rations, extended work hours, loss of Sunday rest, or physical punishment. The legal basis for collective punishment came from the broad discretionary authority granted to slave owners under colonial and state law. No statute specifically authorized it, but no statute prohibited it either, and courts consistently upheld the right of owners to manage their property as they saw fit. The strategic purpose of collective punishment was to transform every enslaved person into a potential informer. If your neighbor's escape attempt meant your children would go hungry for a week, the incentive to report planned escapes was enormous. Collective punishment turned the slave community into a self-policing system, which was exactly the point. Plantation journals from the antebellum period describe collective punishment approvingly as a method of maintaining order with minimal direct intervention. Punishment number 22, slave patrols. Known in the South as patrollers or paddy rollers, these were organized militia groups authorized by state law to patrol rural areas at night. Stop any enslaved person found off a plantation without a pass, search slave quarters for weapons or contraband, and administer punishment on the spot. The patrols were established by law in South Carolina as early as 1704 and were eventually adopted by every slave-holding state. In Virginia, patrol duty was mandatory for all white men between certain ages, making the enforcement of slavery a community obligation, rather than just a planter's concern. Patrol members had legal authority to enter any slave quarter at any time, to whip any enslaved person found without a pass, and to break up any gathering of enslaved people. They carried weapons and often brought dogs trained to track and attack. The patrols were funded by local taxes, meaning that every taxpayer, including those who did not own enslaved people, financially supported the system of enforcement. Historians have drawn direct connections between the slave patrol system and the creation of organized police forces in the southern states. The first formal police department in Charleston, South Carolina, evolved directly from the city's slave patrol. Punishment number 23. Fines for insufficient punishment. And here is one that flips everything you think you know about slavery on its head. In several colonies and states, slave owners could be fined for not punishing their enslaved workers severely enough. The 1740 Negro Act in South Carolina imposed fines on owners who failed to maintain discipline, meaning that an owner who chose not to whip, brand, or otherwise punish an enslaved person for an offense could face legal consequences. In Virginia, owners who were seen as too lenient could be reported by neighbors or overseers, and courts could order specific punishments to be carried out. This law existed because the system of slavery depended on universal enforcement. A single lenient owner could undermine the entire structure by demonstrating that enslaved people could live without constant violence. The fining system ensured that even owners who personally opposed brutality were legally compelled to participate in it. It transformed slave ownership from a choice into a legal obligation of cruelty. Records from South Carolina courts show at least a dozen cases between 1740 and 1800 where owners were fined for failing to punish enslaved workers who had violated curfew or assembly laws. Punishment number 24. Bounty and capture rewards. Every slaveholding state established a legal system of rewards for the capture and return of escaped enslaved people. These rewards transformed every white person in the South into a potential bounty hunter. In Virginia, the reward for capturing a runaway was set by statute and could be claimed by any white person. In the Deep South, rewards could reach hundreds of dollars, a fortune for a poor white farmer. The reward system was not just about recovering escaped people. It was about creating a surveillance network that covered every road, every river crossing, every town and village. An enslaved person attempting to escape did not just have to evade their owner and the patrols. They had to evade every white person they encountered because every white person had a financial incentive to capture them. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 extended this system nationally, requiring citizens in free states to assist in the capture of escaped enslaved people, and imposing fines on anyone who helped them. The bounty system also incentivized violence. Rewards were paid for the return of enslaved people dead or alive, and many bounty hunters chose dead because it was easier. Court records document cases where bounty hunters killed escaped enslaved people and presented the severed body parts as proof of capture to claim their reward. Now we have reached the final 3 punishments. I saved these for last because they are the ones that most historians find hardest to discuss. the ones that reveal the absolute depths to which a legal system can sink when it decides that certain people are not people at all. Punishment number 25. Public execution as spectacle. In every slaveholding jurisdiction, enslaved people convicted of serious offenses, particularly rebellion, murder of a white person, or arson, could be publicly executed. But these were not simply executions. They were orchestrated public events designed to terrorize the entire enslaved population. In New York, after a suspected slave conspiracy in 1741, 13 enslaved people were burned alive at the stake, and 17 were hanged, all in public view. In Virginia, after Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831, 56 enslaved people were executed by the state, and their heads were mounted on poles along the highway as a warning. In Louisiana, after the German Coast Uprising of 1811, the heads of executed rebels were displayed on poles along the river road for 40 miles. The legal system prescribed these public displays deliberately. Execution was not enough. The law required the spectacle, the display of the body, the public demonstration of what happened to those who resisted. The cost of these executions was often reimbursed to the owner by the state, meaning that taxpayers funded both the killing and the display. Court records from Virginia show reimbursement payments ranging from $300 to $800 per executed enslaved person, reflecting their market value. The state was buying the right to destroy them publicly. Punishment number 26, legal castration. This is one of the most suppressed facts in American legal history. In Virginia, a 1723 statute explicitly authorized the castration of enslaved men as punishment for certain offenses, including attempted rape of a white woman and repeat escape attempts. The law was specific. It named castration as a legal penalty and described the procedure to be carried out under the authority of the court. In the Carolinas, similar provisions existed in the early colonial codes. In Jamaica, castration was authorized under the Consolidated Slave Law for cases of rebellion. The practice was so controversial that it became one of the first slavery-era punishments to face organized opposition, not from abolitionists, but from slaveholders themselves who argued that it reduced the productive and reproductive value of their property. Virginia's castration statute was modified in 1769, not abolished, but modified, to allow judges to substitute other punishments at their discretion. The modification did not come from moral objection, it came from economic calculation. But for nearly 50 years, from 1723 to 1769, castration was a fully legal punishment carried out under court authority in one of the most prominent colonies in British America. Court records from that period document at least 30 cases where castration was ordered and carried out. Punishment number 27, salt and pepper. I have deliberately placed this one last because it represents perhaps the most distilled form of cruelty in the entire legal system. After a severe whipping, overseers and owners would rub salt, ground pepper, or a mixture of both into the open wounds. The practice was known colloquially as pickling and was documented extensively in plantation records, court testimony, and the autobiographies of formerly enslaved people. The purpose was twofold: to intensify the pain beyond what the whipping alone could produce, and to cause scarring that would serve as a permanent visible record of punishment. Harriet Jacobs, in her autobiography, described witnessing the practice. Solomon Northup, in his account of 12 years of enslavement, documented it in detail. Court records from North Carolina in the 1840s include testimony from a white overseer who described the practice as routine and standard, something he had been taught when he was hired. The legal status of salt and pepper was never specifically addressed by any legislature. It existed in the enormous legal void where the law's silence was understood as permission. No court ever ruled it illegal. No legislature ever debated it. It simply was. a practice so embedded in the system that it did not even register as something requiring legal authorization. And now we arrive at the twist that makes everything we have discussed even more disturbing. You might assume that when slavery ended, all of these punishments disappeared with it. But here is what actually happened. Many of these laws were never formally repealed. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, and the specific mechanisms of slavery lost their targets. But the statutes themselves, the actual words on the actual pages of actual law books, remained. In South Carolina, elements of the 1740 Negro Act were not formally removed from the legal code until well into the 20th century. In Virginia, vestiges of the 1705 Slave Code lingered in annotated legal references for decades after emancipation. And more importantly, the legal principles that supported these punishments did not disappear. They evolved. The idea that certain categories of people could be legally subjected to different standards of treatment, that assembly could be criminalized, that movement could be restricted, that testimony could be silenced, these concepts found new life in the Black Codes of 1865, the Jim Crow laws of the 1890s, and the mass incarceration policies of the 20th century. The slave patrol system became the police force. The prohibition of testimony became the systematic exclusion of black jurors. The racial curfew became the sundown town. The bounty system became convict leasing. The legal architecture did not collapse when slavery ended. It renovated. Remember the opening of this video. The 1740 Negro Act in South Carolina, which specified exactly which body parts could be destroyed as legal punishment. That law existed because someone sat down with pen and paper and wrote it. Someone else debated it. Someone voted for it. A governor signed it. And for 125 years, it was the law. When we talk about the punishments of slavery, we are not talking about individual acts of cruelty committed by violent individuals. We are talking about a legal system designed by lawyers, approved by legislatures, enforced by courts, and funded by taxpayers, that codified human destruction as bureaucratic procedure. 27 punishments, all legal, all documented, all enforced by the state. Some of these laws are still technically in the books. That is not ancient history. That is a legal reality that shapes the present in ways most people never see. If this changed how you understand the history of law and justice, share it with someone who needs to see it, because the one thing these laws feared most was people knowing they existed.